Hello, everybody, and welcome to the European Marine Board's third Thursday Science webinar series. I am Sheila Heymans. I am the moderator for today. I'm the Executive Director of the European Marine Board, and I will be the host of this webinar. Today, our webinar is about decommissioning, and the title is An Insight into Insight. An Insight stands for the Influence of Structures in the Ecosystem Program. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and this webinar will be live streamed. So some housekeeping rules. Please make sure that your name is clearly entered. So when you ask a question, we know who you are. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. And when you put a question in there, please make sure that your name and hopefully your organization and the country where you're from is in there. I will look at the questions and ask them to the speaker after his presentation. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat, and it's only visible to us, the hosts, and we will answer you if we can help. So as I said, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website, and it is being live streamed through the YouTube channel, the European Marine Board's YouTube channel. So with all of that behind us, as I said, the focus of this science webinar is on decommissioning, and it is really the science behind our policy brief number 3 on decommissioning of offshore man-made installations. If you're interested in the document, you can download it from our website. Our speaker today is Professor Dickon Howell. He is the director and founder of Howell Marine Consulting in the UK, and he's also a visiting professor of practice at Newcastle University School of Natural and Environmental Science in the UK. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and Dickon will start sharing and entertain us for the next half an hour.
Thanks, Sheila. Let me just share the right screen and I've got sound on. Brilliant. Right there. Can you see that?
We can see it, and it's in full screen. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So welcome to today's webinar. As Sheila said, I'm going to be talking today about the INSITE program. And as Sheila said, that's the science behind the policy brief that was put out by EMB in 2017. It's worth noting that quite a lot has changed since 2017. Mostly that the need to decommission is getting ever more urgent as structures are, more and more of them are coming out of our marine environment, and also more and more structures are getting deployed into our marine environment with offshore wind. So understanding how those structures affect the ecosystem is becoming increasingly more important. Today, I'm going to talk through the program. I'm going to talk so that you can understand the projects that we've got running at the moment and the things that we're doing in the future. And I'm going to give you some highlights of some of the projects that are running at the moment. It's worth saying that we are mid-flight, as it were, in the second phase of our program. So what I'm going to be giving is some highlights from the latest updates we've had from the PIs. So the program, as Sheila said, it is about the influence of man-made structures in the ecosystem, primarily the North Sea, but the second phase is looking at how we can take that learning and put it alongside learning from other marine ecosystems to get a kind of more global understanding. Importantly, what we're trying to do within the program is to provide stakeholders with the independent scientific evidence base needed to better understand the influence of man-made structures on the ecosystem of the North Sea. The program itself isn't taking a view either way on what are the correct options for decommissioning. What we are intending to do is to provide that evidence base with which policymakers and all others involved in decommissioning can make sure that they are making the right decision for the case in front of them. So why is this important? Well, in the North Sea, we've got this large number of artificial hard substrates that go onto natural sandy and muddy bottoms, and they go from the seafloor to the surface. So you get this fundamental formal difference on hard and soft bottom substrates, but also there's a lot of them. So that map on the right there, you can see we've got over 1,300 oil and gas installations. The time that map was taken, there are 2,800 wind turbines, but round 4 offshore wind in the UK is going to put up to another 4,000 in, I think, and there are further rounds planned both in the UK and in Denmark, and understanding what those structures do to the marine environment is really important. I'm just going to show you, rather than me tell you, I'm just going to put a video on now for a couple of minutes that will demonstrate some of the things that we're looking at and why it's important. So hopefully this is going to work. Great, so that cut a bit short at the end there, but hopefully you get the picture. It's a really important ecosystem that's changed a lot over the last 30 years and is looking to change even more over the next 10 or 20. So the INSITE programme has run in 2 phases. The first phase, which ran from 2014 to 2017, had 8 research projects and was sponsored wholly by industry with an independent science advisory board. And you can see there we had researchers from the UK, but also partners from Europe as well. That project was really successful, and for the first time set up the data project, which I'll talk about in a moment, and really fostered this sense of collaboration between industry and the research scientists, so that they could for the first time get their hands on some of the data that industry were collecting from environmental monitoring and see how they can use it in research. That model of working with industry was so successful that when INSITE phase 1 finished in 2017, there was a joint collaboration between INSITE and NERC and CFAS to take the work that was done in phase 1 and continue it. And so we've been running INSITE phase 2 since 2018. We're now, I guess, in about year 3 of the projects after they've got up and running, and of course we've had COVID in the middle of that. The programme itself is about £7 million split across these 7 research projects, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. I've been fortunate enough, I've sat on the programme advisory group for INSITE at the end of phase 1 and in phase 2, and we're now providing the programme director role for the programme, which is fascinating, so we get to get involved in all sides of it. So what I'm going to do is talk you through, give you an overview of each of the 7 projects, pick out some of the highlights from phase 2, and then I'm going to give you a bit more of a deeper dive into 2 of the projects that reported back to the programme advisory group actually a couple of weeks ago. So to run you through these projects, we've got 3 on this slide and 4 on the next. So I'm just going to run you through them. The first is EcoStar. So this is run by Debbie Russell from St Andrews. This project is looking at the ecosystem level importance of structures as artificial reefs. They're aiming to improve our understanding of the importance of man-made structures as habitat for benthic communities, and to measure how man-made structures influence the distribution and movement patterns of marine mammals in the North Sea. Dan Jones from the National Oceanography Centre is running at sea. This is this is one of the projects I'm going to talk about later. They are really looking to push the boundaries for autonomous environmental monitoring of multiple man-made structures without the aid of a support vessel. And for those of you from the UK, you'll recognise that the name of their autonomous vehicle is Boaty McBoatface, which is the autonomous vehicle that got named that after a public vote on our new polar research vessel that's eventually ended up getting called the RSS David Attenborough. Paul Fernandez from University of Aberdeen, they're looking at the aggregation, production and spillover, the cumulative effects of man-made offshore structures on fish. So they're looking at new and legacy acoustic data. So this is using data from industry, as well as going out and collecting new data to estimate the density of fish as a function of distance to man-made structures, and also to estimate the abundance of fish at all man-made structures. It's obviously really important when we're looking at how man-made structures affect the productivity of an ecosystem, but also their importance for other uses of the sea, in particular fishing. So these are the other 4 here. Natalie Hicks from University of Essex is looking at the functionality and ecological connectivity of man-made structures. So she's looking at how the removal or placement of these structures affect marine biodiversity and ecosystem function, including ecosystem services and economic value of those associated benthic habitats. Is a really important component, looking at that kind of ecosystem scale level. Paul Summerfield, it's good to see. I think I saw Paul on the webinar earlier. Dreams is looking at relative effects of alternative management strategies and decommissioning. So Paul's team is conducting this comprehensive and systematic analysis of all available relevant information to understand the roles of installations in the sea and how these vary under decommissioning scenarios. And that's starting to tell us some really important things about the state of the evidence base that's in front of us. Chasons, Joe Porter from Heriot-Watt, looking at the connectivity of hard substrate assemblages in the North Sea. So what role does substrate have on the connectivity of epifaunal populations, and how will network connectivity be altered by future changes following decommissioning and or installation? This is a really important question, not just looking at the propagation of species across the North Sea from oil and gas structures, but also being able to understand what happens to that connectivity, that network connectivity, when we start putting lots more offshore wind structures in. And there are questions that are relevant there around some risks such as invasive species, but also to general ecosystem health. And finally, Tom, and this is another one that I'm going to go into in a bit more detail with NS3D, from SAMS. They're using novel 3D imaging to quantify biomass and secondary production on artificial structures. I'm going to touch on this briefly here because I've got some slides on this. So they are looking at novel 3D imaging techniques and machine learning and using them to provide data to model the relationship between ecosystem function and artificial structures within the North Sea. And the exciting thing about that for I guess a non-marine ecosystem person is the tech that they're using and developing that is taking ROV, so video from these structures, and using machine learning to not only produce 3D models of it, but 3D models that can identify the species that are on those structures. So some highlights of the research so far, and this is where it sort of starts to get interesting. And it's worth saying that because of COVID, some of the projects are a bit further behind than they could have been because they didn't manage to get to sea. but there's some really interesting things coming out already. So within EcoStar, we already knew that marine predators showed preferential use of structures for foraging, but what they're starting to find is that seals may also be using them for navigation, which is something that we didn't know before. At sea, this is Boating at Boatface, and again, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail. They are planning an autonomous voyage with Boating at Boatface over 1,500 kilometres, travelling from Shetland around the North Sea, visiting 3 decommissioning fields and an MPA before returning to Shetland, all autonomously, which is pretty amazing. And they are really, I guess, testing the boundaries of what we can do with autonomous vehicles and marine monitoring. Fish spam, so they were looking at fish densities, and what they're starting to find is that these fish densities might be elevated over much greater ranges from these structures than previously reported. Some of the previous rigs to reef studies have shown that you get these densities tens of meters from platforms. Some of their studies some of their findings are starting to show that these densities might remain elevated several kilometers from a platform, which is really important when we're talking about spillover effects from these, I guess, unofficial MPAs where people can't go, and the spillover effects of those onto fishing grounds that will be some distance from those structures. Similarly, when we're talking about these unofficial MPAs, FuelComs is looking at the 500-meter exclusion zone, which protects the seabed from much human activity. And we'll talk briefly about trawling. They're starting to articulate that these sediments are vital stores of blue carbon, and trying to then calculate how much that sediment disruption could have implications for climate change. Dreams. So Dreams is in the middle of their work at the moment, and what they're starting to see that is, although the evidence base has grown exponentially since the 70s, there are really key gaps in critical areas required for the design of sustainable ecosystem decommissioning options that consider environmental, social, and economic benefits. And a really greater understanding of these impacts is required to ensure that decommissioning options deliver optimal ecosystem outcomes. And what we're really hoping to see from the Dreams project is that those gaps are made really clear, so that we can be really focused and targeted about the research that needs to be done to fill those gaps, and to make sure that those decommissioning option assessments have got the best information that they possibly can have. Chasons, again, Chasons has been working really closely with the oil and gas industry to understand mitigation for environmental risk associated with the removal and deployment of infrastructure. In particular, really looking at how we can get in really close to those structures to do environmental monitoring in a safe way. And NS3D, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, they've done some really cool stuff around training computers to identify most elements of marine growth and then superimpose that identity onto 3D models generated from ROV footage. Some of the things they found already is that this anemone is a dominant taxon on North Sea man-made structures, and that they host communities of cold water corals, something that Maury Roberts' research group has recently found as well. And wasn't previously known, and these cold water corals are really important species, and gives a whole new kind of perspective on the importance of these structures. Importantly, again, when we think about why NS3D is important for industry, when these structures are being removed from the marine environment, it's really important that the operators know what's on them, because once they have removed them, if they do have to remove them, they then have to remove all of that marine growth, and understanding what it is before you bring it out of the water is really important. So those are just some of the highlights of the research so far. What I'm going to do now is talk through just 2 of those projects. Given the time we've got, I would love to go through all 7 of them, but I've just picked 2 of them out. And then I'm going to talk to you a bit about what INSITE is looking forward to, I guess, over the next couple of years. So the first one I'm going to talk about briefly is North Sea 3D, which is what I was just talking about, and this is being run by the team from SAMS. So their aim is to improve marine growth biomass estimates for North Sea structures, combining photogrammetry and machine learning, which I'll talk about a bit in a minute. What's really interesting about this is they're using their own ROV footage, remotely operated vehicle footage, but they're also looking to see whether they can use industry footage. And if you think the amount of footage that comes from the oil and gas industry for inspections, not just environmental inspections, but structural integrity inspections that they do of structures and pipelines, that is just sitting there, and they're really looking to see whether they can really use that mass of data to build up our knowledge. So for those of you that don't know what 3D photogrammetry is, and I have to confess, until I had this presentation from them a couple of weeks ago, I kind of knew what it was, but it was just really useful to put this into context. So they, how it works, you have common points in overlapping 2D images. So you get two cameras, and where the lines of sight intersect, they give you the 3D coordinates of the points that you're looking at. And the accuracy of measurements improves as more observations are added. So their ROV has two cameras on, and can take these separate views, and from that they can create a 3D image. They then use machine learning. So they are using modern machine learning, convolutional neural nets, which has revolutionized image analysis, and they're now training machines to identify marine growth. So they've got to a point where their machines can be trained to identify if an image contains an object, how many objects it's contained, and to classify each pixel in an image. So this is the ROV survey of a structure. Now let's let that play. So you can, a couple of minutes, not a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds. You can see the anemones there. And what they do then from that is they get a 3D model, which is in the middle there. And then on the right, you can see how the computer has then color coded the different species of that growth on the model. And from that, we can start making estimates about biomass. And from that, there is what we can learn about biodiversity and productivity, but also there are some really important operational things for the operators that they can take away from that. And again, just to show you another slide where we've got the 3D model on the side there, and then the auto identification on the right, and you can see where it's identified those two species there. And then from that model on the right, they've extracted the species volumes so we can get total biomass, which is quite amazing that you can get down to this much detail to understand not just the species but the biomass without actually getting a diver in the water, which I think is pretty amazing. So in summary, from the ROV footage that they've acquired, they're successfully generating these 3D models from industry ROV footage, as well as their own. They're training models to identify marine growth, and they're successfully linking the auto-identification of that marine growth to those 3D models. There's a lot of technical challenges in there, not least in deploying kit offshore, but also technically back at the desk in terms of the computer programming that goes on behind that. There are major challenges obtaining sufficient ROV footage from across the North Sea, and we're working with the oil and gas industry and within the INSITE program to see if we can meet that over the next couple of years. So the other project I wanted to give you a bit more detail on was at sea, which is using boating with Boatface. Again, pushing the boundaries of technology. They are carrying out the first fully autonomous environmental monitoring of multiple decommissioning sites without the aid of a support vessel. They're using their autonomous vehicle to combine seafloor visual imagery, mapping, and water column sensor-based measurements to produce this integrated environmental assessment at sites relevant to decommissioning. They can then directly compare the autonomously collected data with corresponding data obtained by current standard methods in the same areas, and really demonstrate how a fully autonomous approach can lead to major advances in data quality, quantity, and cost savings over traditional approaches. It's worth saying that in the UK, NERC has invested tens of millions of pounds over the last decade in our autonomous fleet. And what we're starting to see is that the data that they're collecting and the way that they're collecting it is now got to a technology readiness level that is getting to be almost comparable with ship-based survey. And once we can test that and prove that, it could have massive implications for how we do marine monitoring. So this is the route they're taking. They're launching it from shore in Shetland, and then they're going up to the Don decommissioning site, which you can see in the top right there, which is at 160 meters depth. It's in an entirely subsea development with pipelines, which is actually set for decommissioning during the project. They then go to Northwest Hutton, which is a quite well-known decommissioning site that was decommissioned in 2009. Then down through the Braemar pot marks, which are a special area of conservation under the habitats regulations, that has known persistent hydrocarbon seepage. So they're using that as an analog for a decommissioning leakage scenario. And the sniffer technology on board is hopefully going to be able to pick up those hydrocarbon seepages and locate them. Then past the Miller site, and then back to Shetland. So the transit length, it says 750 kilometers there, but I think that's out and then back again. So it's double, it's 1,500 kilometers, and will take 20 days. And this is Boating McBoatface itself. You can see the size of the sub there, and that's just some of the technology it's carrying. But I thought you might be interested to see how big it is. Yeah, I think that picture is probably taken at the NAC. And then to give you an idea of scale, if you kind of picture in your head the size of the technician there against the auto sub, and then you look at the size of the people against, this is the Northwest Hutton jacket, and it gives you a bit of an idea about the scale of the sites that we're going to. Yeah, and you can really see how actually using these autonomous vehicles, you can not only get close, but potentially get in and around it as well. So those are the two projects I'm going to give you a bit more detail on, and I'm just going to give you maybe 10 or 15 minutes now on what's next for INSITE, and what we're doing aside from the research projects over the next few years, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So alongside the NERC funded program, which is funding the science, we have a stream of industry funded work. And the industry funded work, these are the three main things that we're looking at. The first is INSITE Interactive, which I'll talk about in a moment, is our GIS-based data sharing project that's aimed at making industry data available for scientific research. We have a PhD scholarship program where we have 6 PhD scholarships awarded across 4 institutes, 2 in Europe and 2 in the UK. Those PhDs are up and running nearly. I think two of the institutes are in the process of recruiting PhDs, and 2 will be doing so very shortly. And then the synthesis project, which I'm going to talk about briefly as well. I've got some more slides on this, which is looking at how do we take all the work that INSITE's done since 2014 and pull that together into a report that is easily understandable for policymakers, decision makers, and industry, and it is undertaken by a team of international scientists. So we're not just talking about the INSITE PIs here. I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment. Before I do that, This is INSITE Interactive. So INSITE Interactive is a GI system. One of the challenges that researchers have always had is how to get hold of industry data. We know that there are terabytes of data that have been collected for decades, but trying to get hold of them is really difficult. And part of the reason for that is that it's not always clear about where that data is, what that data is, who holds it, how you can get hold of it. And so through the INSITE program, we've set up a data initiative where we have talked to our industry partners who are funding and some of those who are not funding, and work through all of the data agreements that we need to get in place so that they can get their metadata up onto this GIS site. The PI researchers can then go and look on this GIS site for areas of interest. They will be able to see which of our industry partners have got data and which of it is relevant to them, and they can then request that data from the industry partners, and we will work with them to make sure that data management process is facilitated. This is still in early days. It's only been up for 12 months or so. We're still working it through, but there is an inordinate amount of data that we want to try and get to the INSITE researchers as quickly as possible. The INSITE synthesis. So for me, this is one of the most important bits of the INSITE program. We've done all this really great research, which I've talked through today, and you always come to the so what question. And the INSITE synthesis work is looking to address that so what question. So the aim of this project is to understand the scientific consensus on the environmental implications of deploying man-made structures at scale, leaving them in situ or removing them based on the existing evidence base being established under INSITE, phases 1 and 2, and other relevant global studies. What we're looking at here, and these are some delivery assumptions for this project, that we're going to be looking to demonstrate what is the scientific consensus on the role of man-made structures in the marine environment. We'll cover all relevant industries, so oil and gas and offshore wind mainly, and all stages of the project lifecycle. We've brought together a coalition of UK and international scientists. So we've got upwards of 30 of the best experts in the world on this project, working within a group towards what will effectively be a peer review publication at the end of it from all of them. So that idea of consensus building as a community is really important to provide this science advice to the international policy and commercial landscape. So the synthesis is going to consider evidence of many kinds, but will be focused on the science. So what we're interested in looking at here is saying not what are the challenges with working within regulatory regimes in different parts of the world, but what is the science saying to us about how man-made structures are changing ecosystems, whether that's positive or negative, and what are the impacts of taking those man-made structures out of ecosystems, and is that positive or negative, and then handing that over to policymakers to inform their decision-making around future options, both for decommissioning and deployment. So this project at the moment is being run by Paul Summerfield, who's the PI on DREAMS, and this broadly is the kind of process they're going through. Project inception phase, and we've been through this. We've assembled our core drafting group and the contributory group of researchers. We've been working through these workshops to understand what people think the key science questions are that need answering, what should be the conceptual models and cause-effect relationships that we need to be considering when we're looking at scenarios, and what should our criteria be for comparing and ranking different outcomes, and how are we going to bring the evidence base in to that discussion. It's really important here that we're moving from a place where we are asking the scientific community their opinion, and then looking at the evidence base to demonstrate how the evidence base can reinforce that scientific opinion, and develop consensus. So this next point about working through those scenarios, and then the community members independently scoring and ranking the pathways within those scenarios, and then getting to a point where we have a review paper. So it's really important that we go through the peer review process, because the scientific integrity of this paper is sort of paramount. But once we've done that, we will be going into a stage of developing policy relevant science advice communications, digital dissemination products, and engaging with key stakeholders so that they really understand what it is that we're trying to do. I guess we are always aiming to try and do the best that we can, and I guess the model that we're looking at here is some of the work that's been done in climate for IPPC globally, and things like MSIP here in the UK, where we're really trying to produce some work that says this is the scientific consensus at this moment in time. And I think we'll do this now, and there is a good possibility we'll do it in 2 or 3 years' time when INSITE is completely finished, so that we can see how the science has changed. So that's where INSITE's going, and it's worth watching this space. This project, we're hoping to get finished by the end of this year, so we're not too far away. Yeah, we are at the moment just in the UK looking at the synthesis bit of work which has global reach, but in the UK looking at how INSITE can then build on the new programs coming out of NERC, such as EcoWind, which is going to be looking at the ecological consequences of offshore wind, and programs like the sustainable management of marine resources, so that we're making sure that we're building on that evidence base all the time. That's all for me in terms of slides. I'm just going to leave you with another short video of Fuurkomst, the University of Aberdeen. This is a video of them deploying their own autonomous vehicle from the shore to go out and survey for fish aggregations around some offshore installations. So I'm just going to move this on and press play, and then after that we'll have time for some questions. Great, thank you. And as I said at the beginning, do go to the website if you want any more information. Great, thank you. Sheila, should I stop sharing?
Yeah, that's probably best. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dickon. Okay, so now for questions and answers. Well, questions at least from my side, and answers hopefully from yours. I'll start with the ones in the Q&A. The first one is from Tom Christian Hoffman, who says, great presentation of the extremely interesting project. What do you expect how the biomass or growth or abundance ecosystem services will go along with environmental issues such as acidification and rising ocean temperatures? I think the question is, do you think it'll change, and how do you think it'll change?
I think it will undoubtedly change. How it changes is difficult to give a broad assessment of that, because I think each ecosystem will change in different ways. What's interesting is that when you look at the new research programs, certainly coming out of NERC, so EcoWind, which is looking to build a ecosystem model of the North Sea for cumulative effect assessment has specific requirements in it to make sure that the baseline of that model includes climate change, acidification, rising ocean temperature. But yeah, I think there is undoubtedly going to be change. Whether that's positive or negative is difficult to say without going into individual species, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, and then the second question by an anonymous attendee, which didn't follow the instructions I gave in the beginning, says again, great talk. How has this work been landing with decision makers, and what barriers do you think remain in place to integrate the work into the regulatory decisions?
We've had great interaction with decision makers since INSITE started. I think so. There's always this real challenge at how do you take fundamental research and have impact into decision making and there are lots of reasons around that. Those are to do with things like so basic things like communication and timeframes. So often policymakers need research that is right here and now, and a research project might be lasting for 3 years and it can't get included. One of the things that we are working towards with the synthesis project is to really start exploring how do we get this big body of work and put it into a format that is digestible and useful for decision makers. And again, I keep referring back to EcoWind, but what we're starting to see with applied research programs in the UK and elsewhere is this idea of how you drive impact is built in at the beginning. And that has been done to some degree in INSITE. But it's worth noting that the synthesis project is there to provide that link. So we'll really see how valuable it's going to be in the next 12 months, I think.
Thanks. And I have an actual follow-up question from myself on that, specifically the link with the policymakers. A lot of the projects that you discussed, and I think most of the projects you highlighted, are very UK-based in as much as the science. How do you plan to link also with European policymakers? Because I'm assuming that this is very much linked to the UK policymakers, but as we know, with that horrible B word, there's now a dichotomy of policy. So how do you plan to do that?
So the drafting group, so INSITE Phase 2 is really UK focused, mainly because it's funded by NERC. The synthesis project, we've brought back in the PIs, some of the PIs from INSITE Phase 1, particularly from the institutes in the Netherlands. And we've also got researchers from America and Australia on that drafting group. So we are really trying to produce that global picture. I think when we get a bit further down the line, we will be looking to engage with, I guess, some of the regional seas groups where appropriate, like OSPAR, but also using those PIs and the connections they have into those regulatory decision makers to try and feed that information in. The synthesis work, we really don't want it to be just North Sea. It needs to be North Sea and all the other really good work that's going on in the Southern Hemisphere and in America as well. So.
Okay, thanks. Then another question from the Q&A from Lucy Crooks. Again, interesting presentation. What is the confidence of the auto ID compared with traditional survey methods? I'm not sure which part that was about.
Yeah, so that's about NS3D, which is the work that SAMS are doing. I can't answer that question, but what I can do is get in touch with Tom Welding at SAMS, who will be able to answer that for you. I don't have that detail to hand right now, I'm afraid.
Having worked at SAMS before, I'm pretty sure that they're actually probably testing it with diving surveys, I imagine, because that's what they were doing when I was there at the time. So, okay. But it's probably good if you get the real answer. So
yeah. Okay,
then a question from Georgios Kazanidis, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Offshore Industries, who's an Offshore Industries Advice Manager from JNCC. Again, very interesting. And the question is mainly about fish PAMs. Is there an idea what is the driver shaping the enhanced fish densities around the platforms? So do the fish use the platforms as feeding grounds? Or is there some other reasons?
So the findings that they found about their fish densities, they've literally found from data that they've analysed from their last research cruise, which was the back end of last year. So they're still trying to figure out that question, to be honest. I think that's some of the excitement of seeing interim results midway through a program. I guess the assumption is that they're aggregating around them in the same way that they aggregate around more fish aggregating devices. The question of why those aggregations are appearing at those distances from them and what's happening there, I think they're still trying to figure that out at the moment.
And I'm going to jump in with one of my questions, or possibly a suggestion for Paul and his team, that in fact it would be really interesting to look at the wider ecosystem impacts of those wider areas, because I suspect there will be some really interesting ecosystem interactions happening at wider scales then. So yeah, I'll definitely be watching the space. So.
Yeah.
I will also say that jumping over one question, Kiro Di Fiore asked if you could put your links up at the end of the presentation. Maybe you want to do that now, while I ask the next question, which is from Sally Klink, who is from the Baltic Sea Advisory Council. So she's from the stakeholder body. So thank you for a good, interesting talk. Are stakeholders positively buying into this and feeling involved? So political decisions, say for more renewable energy, take into account the other users of marine space. So do they take into account the others?
Yeah, I think so. The question of how we engage with stakeholders has been an interesting one for this program, because we don't have a specific component in it that says look at different options for policy delivery, for example. So we don't have a component in that says what is the best option for decommissioning. What we are doing is producing an evidence base for those stakeholders to take in. I think maybe the next phase of INSITE may look much more closely at those actual practical operational things. That being said, the stakeholders that we've spoken to both in the UK and Europe, everyone is really interested in the work that's coming out. We just need to make sure that as a program, we've got nearly 10 years worth of research, that we are pulling that together into a coherent whole at the end that can be used, rather than a set of really interesting and valuable papers, but that live in the academic literature rather than in the operational kind of policy world. I hope that answers your question.
Can you hear me? Okay,
go.
sorry,
Yes.
I was gone for a moment. It's an internet problem. So I have another question. Oh no, it's just a comment from Georgia, so that's fine. I do have a few questions that came from my team, from the Marine Board team. So if I can open my chat, I can ask those. The first one, both from Paula Kellett. She said, will you also be looking at decommissioning of other types of structures in water, so beyond wind, oil and gas? And is there much known or studied on these other structures?
So interestingly, so we are looking at wind, oil and gas and RECs. And RECs are really good analogues for what happens if you leave structures in the marine environment, because they've been there, a lot of them been there for tens, if not sometimes hundreds of years. Yeah, that's the scope of the program as it is, and I think as far as possible, what we're trying to do is to be I guess, industry agnostic to some degree. So we're looking at the structures then and hoping that the findings can then be applied across different industries. What we haven't done is looked at structures on the coast, so ports and coastal defence and that those kind of things.
Thanks. I think there's been quite a bit of work on port, so that's probably less of an issue. And then another question by Paula is, how engaged and receptive is the industry to this program and the findings that are coming out?
So industry are really engaged. We have the way INSITE's set up. We have an industry executive committee which has 8 oil and gas companies on it who are providing some of the funding, and then we have a program advisory group which is our science advisory group, and basically you have a funding body and the science advisory group which is made up of researchers and chaired by Sir Ian Boyd, and the science advisory group signs off the scientific integrity of the program effectively, but industry are engaged through the industry executive committee, and I think not just engaged in terms of funding, but you saw the slides I had about data, which has been massively valuable, but also having those contacts so that the PIs can actually get out and do their research cruises, deploy their autonomous vehicles right up close to these structures and get a working relationship that's sort of quite difficult to establish if you're a researcher working on your own. And we're trying to help facilitate that within the program.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, and then I have another question. I have loads, but and it comes back to the data that you just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So this GIS database sounds super interesting, and I think it will be great for scientists working on it. But is this database linked to other, say EMODnet or some of the other big databases in Europe and also MEDIN or something in the UK or?
Yeah, so the phases of the INSITE Interactive, the first phase was, I guess, just getting industry on board and getting the GI database up and running. And at the moment, that's a closed GI system for people who are in the project. Mainly because I think our industry partners, I don't think they get nervous. I think their lawyers get nervous about releasing data just generally. So there is some control around that, and the INSITE Interactive means that we can set up those data sharing agreements on an as needs basis with the people that want them. We're currently running a review of INSITE Interactive, which actually kicked off last week. And within that review, we're not only looking at how well that data is being used, but also how easy it is for researchers to get it, and looking at some of these questions about how do we get it out to a broader audience, and if we were going to get it out to a broader audience, how would we interact with MEDIN, how would we interact with EMODnet, how would we interact with things like the Crown Estates and Marine Data Exchange. There are a bunch of them out there at the moment, we want to make sure that this data is as broadly available as possible, but making sure that we do it in a way that the data owners are comfortable with and isn't duplicating other work that's going on, because there is a lot of data work going on at the moment. We'll hopefully find out. That review is due to finish in June time, and then hopefully the next stage is to go and start talking to some of the other bigger data initiatives both in the UK and Europe and seeing how we can link in.
I think, in all honesty, if you link it to one open database, then the others will find it. For instance, if it's in MEDIN, then I think EMODnet will probably be able to link to it fine. So you really only need to do this job once, but you need to do it once with the right partner.
With the right people, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I see Paul is put in the chat that the INSITE database is a meta database, and actually getting access to the data is quite complicated, which doesn't surprise me at all.
Yes, yeah, no, that is true. And the reason it's complicated is that we're dealing with 9 or 10 different data owners who haven't given an open access agreement. So it is a metadatabase, and we then need to go through a process of putting data sharing agreements in with each institution that wants that data, which is quite different to a kind of open access database. So yeah, there are hoops to jump through.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I have loads more comments, but I'll leave it at that. I don't know if there's any other questions. I don't see any other questions from anybody, but I think I would just leave it at thank you very much, Dickon. That was really great. It's great to see what you guys are doing. And it will be really interesting to follow up on the sort of synthesis project and the sort of linking with policymakers. That's kind of what we do at the Marine Board. So we might want to try and think about that in some sort.
I think that would be good. Yeah, I think that would be good.
Yeah. And then finally, I think I just want to quickly share my screen again to say, again, thank you very much, Dickon. But just for those of you that are still online, our next third Thursday science webinar will be on Thursday, the 19th of April, 1300 hours CST. And it will be by our early career scientists, by our young ambassadors that are outgoing. So Natalia Dunik and Alexandra Kreski, who will talk about their experiences of being a young ambassador. So please join us next week. Next month. And yeah, it'd be great to speak to you then. Uncle is asking whether it's the 21st of April or the 19th of April. Maybe you need to check our website because maybe we got the date wrong here. So thank you very much, everybody. And with that, I think we will close this webinar.